Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about fears and monsters. That'll become more clear as we work our way through this, because the title of the book is Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. It is published by Baker Books. It came out just a couple of weeks ago, so you should be able to find it in your local bookstore, but you know what we always do. We provide an opportunity for you to get a copy of it if you want to go to our website and get it either in paperback or Kindle. We also have a connection to our author, Luke Norsworthy, because not only is he the author of this book, he has a great podcast that you might want to know more about. A graduate of Abilene Christian University, senior pastor of the 1,500-member Westover Hills Church of Christ in Austin, Texas. Also, of course, the host of the Newsworthy with Norsworthy podcast, an individual that interviews some of the same people we interview here on Point of View. So, Luke, just great to have you on the program with us today.
Well, I'm very honored that you would take the time to talk with me. So it is my pleasure.
You know, I was just thinking, when you wrote this book about fear, you probably weren't thinking of the fear that people would have about getting a disease during a pandemic and being sick or even dying. You probably weren't thinking about the fears people might have during protest and riots. But I just couldn't help but think that how appropriate your book is given where we find ourselves here in this year.
Well, you're obviously correct. When I wrote this book, I didn't have any foreknowledge about what was going to be transpiring right now. But obviously, what we do see is there's a lot of fears that are played out in multiple different fronts. And, the fears that I talk about in the book are real fears that our monsters become, in some ways placeholders for them, because monsters are fake, but our fake monsters represent the real fears that we have. And if there's anything that is in abundance right now, it is, like you said, fear.
And again, we're going to talk about a little bit later these universal monsters of comparison and more and success. But I thought before we get there, let's talk about this, because you use this idea of monsters and having children who had to sleep on the floor before you had a night light and all sorts of other things, or all of us wondering about werewolves and things of that nature. As you said, monsters aren't real, but fears are, and sometimes they come to us almost like those monsters of our childhood, don't they?
Yeah. Sometimes they just show up in ways that, we don't want to deal with them. Because when you're a kid and you hear a sound in the back of your closet when you're trying to go to sleep all alone in your room, there's two responses. The first response is you're going to hide underneath the covers, pretend like you didn't hear it, hope that it's going to go away. And the second option is you get up, you grab a lightsaber, you stuff a pillow underneath your shirt, and you go to the closet and you're going to face that monster, whatever it is. You're going to look at it, you're going to get a flashlight and inspect and find it. And when we get older, the idea of hiding underneath our bed gets more mature, and now it looks like being obsessed with our work, living vicariously through our kids, abusing chocolate or alcohol or social media or whatever. Yes. But we're all doing the same thing. We're hiding from them. And so you got two options. You can either run from them or you can face your monsters. And here's the thing about monsters. They get you to go where you don't want to go, because when you go where you don't want to go, only then and in that place can you become everything you're created to be. And I think that's how God works in the process.
I just think it's wonderful. And again, I love the monstrous metaphor that you talk about. But let's go back to your position for just a minute as the senior pastor in an outstanding church there in Austin. And that is, when your church has people fill out prayer cards, I love what you say. There's one theme that runs through them all: fear of finances, fear of the future, fear of not being enough, fear of not having enough, fear for my kids' well-being, fear of never being able to move on from the past. It is amazing if you understand that is such a motivator in the negative, sometimes in the positive sense too. Fear so dominates our lives that we almost don't realize how much we are motivated by fear, do we?
I completely agree. And like you said, I mean, when we do the prayer of the people exercise, that's what we call that prayer card exercise. They come in and I'll get a stack of them, and I will do my best every time we get them to read through them. And what you find is, fear that, I'm not going to be able to take care of myself in retirement. I'm not going to be able to, I don't know what to do with my kids. I don't know what I'm going to do about, my own work situation. And fear is all around us. But like you said, sometimes, fear helps. Like when you are in the forest and you hear a sound and you think it's like a bear or a snake that's coming for you, fear helps you because it gets you moving. It gets you to run. The problem is when fear moves into the driver's seat, when it doesn't serve as an aid, because there are times you need to be afraid. Obviously, that's how you survive. But when it comes to your day in and day out, normal resting kind of existence, if fear is always driving that, then it's taken over you. And I think as much as I want to say fear can be something that's positive, that you need to befriend your fear and your monsters, we would be naive if we think fear can only be a good thing for us. Because I think there's a pull that all of our fears have on us that pulls us away from our Creator and our God's best intention for us.
Yes.
Yeah, and they can get us away from that. And when you let fear be unchecked, it pulls you farther and farther away from what Jesus came to give us.
Again, let's, if we can, maybe focus on the 3 Ds: dark, destroy, and deliver. Then, of course, a little bit later, we'll get into the universal monsters, which I want to save a little bit later. But one of those is the idea of into the dark. Darkness sometimes can be helpful in the sense that, as you sort of talk about, you lean into the dark, you experience it. You, in some respects, need to overcome that. You don't need to be like your, a 15-month-old that slept on the floor and got hit in the head. By the way, my kids did that too, so I guess it's not just you, it's universal, because they were scared, and then once you put in a nightlight, they weren't. But sometimes leaning into the dark is a good idea, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you have to go where you don't want to go so you can become everything you're created to be. And the darkness, at least the way I use the metaphor, I'm not really referring to how bright your room is. I'm referring to the places that, your bright personality, your bright accomplishments, your idealistic pictures that you post on social media. I'm referring to that as like the antithesis of what the darkness is. The darkness is where all your best techniques and tricks for making you feel better about yourself than you really deserve, when those don't work, that's the darkness. When all of a sudden I can't tell a joke, I can't be successful enough, I can't do anything but take a real honest look at who I am, what I've become, where I'm going, and what I have created of a mess that I'm in. And so I think when you go into those places of vulnerability, I think that's where you meet God, because God doesn't care about the external idealized picture that we put out. God looks at the heart. And so I think that's where we meet God. And that's why you have to go to the dark, because that's where God wants to find us.
Yeah. And again, I think we all learn more from our failures than our successes. We learn more sometimes in the dark places than we do in the places of light and where we have fame and success, which, of course, sets us up for some of the things we're going to talk about after the break. This is just a fascinating book, Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. We'll come back and talk about a couple of those other Ds real quickly: destroy and deliver. Then we'll get into these universal monsters, which all of us face, and how to address those from a biblical point of view. So lots to cover. Luke Norsworthy with us, and we'll continue our conversation with him right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Berry opens his commentary with these words: 246 years after the U.S. Army was established, today's Department of Defense appears to be distracted from its national defense mission. He should know. He has served as a Marine in the military and heads up the military division of First Liberty Institute. He is also the only conservative participant in the Pentagon's newly formed Countering Extremism Working Group. He explains that the Pentagon is on a mission to identify and remove whoever it labels as extremists from America's armed forces. Unfortunately, he notes that the working group has yet to define what it means by extremism. His experience in defending chaplains and other members of the military lead him to conclude that this working group may target constitutionally protected speech. In other words, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words are the biggest threat. Usually, when we are talking about religious liberty cases within the military, we're talking about threats from outside groups that object to chaplains being too religious. Imagine that. But now there appears to be threats to First Amendment rights from within the military itself. He acknowledges that eradicating the scourge of actual extremism is a noble undertaking, but this latest program within the administration will certainly divide us. The message being sent seems to suggest that conservatives and religious people are unwelcome in the military. Yet these values that these groups hold to are what encouraged Michael Berry to join the Marine Corps. Those would be love of country, pride in service, and respect for selfless service and sacrifice. I appreciate him for alerting us to these concerns, and I applaud him for serving on the working group. I just wish there were more like him serving in that capacity. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, continue our conversation with Luke Norsworthy. And again, the book is entitled Befriending Your Monsters. It is published by our friends at Baker. And we'll get into these three universal monsters in just a minute, which, of course, are very important. The idea of comparison, more, the idea that I need more, and success. But just before we do so, one of the other chapters is talking about destroy. And if nothing else, you start the chapter by talking about the so-called Milgram experiment. I don't think we've talked about this on this program in probably decades, but it's a good illustration, if nothing else, of the sinfulness of human individuals, human depravity, and how sometimes if we don't have empathy, we can bring a great deal of harm to others. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, well, clearly my father is a psychologist. That's why I have to put in somewhat antiquated psychological studies into my book, even though I'm a pastor.
I'm glad you did.
Yeah. Well, so the study comes out. In some ways, it's post Holocaust, in which the question was being asked: if you get put in a terrible situation, what kind of things would you do? And if anyone has heard of kind of the somewhat infamous Eichmann in Jerusalem trial, where the conclusion was in what's described as like the banality of evil, that you want it to seem like this person who did awful, atrocious things is this hideous monster, but he just seems kind of like your normal mid-level kind of manager trying to aspire for a little bit more of success. And so what happened is you had, in the States, some psychologists who are trying to take this information and go, is this really true? And so what you did, there's actually probably like two studies that kind of conclude this, including the Stanford prison study. But both of these studies put people in situations in which they are given the opportunity to follow the rules and hurt people, but they're simply following the rules, so they don't feel like a monster. So the study from that Milgram led up at Yale, where you have people go into this room and they're paired up with someone that they don't realize is an actor. And they're told, we want you to continue to shock this person whenever they give a wrong answer. And they don't realize the other person's not really getting shocked. They don't realize the other person who they think is even getting shocked is really an actor. They don't understand all that's going on. All they're testing really is how high of the voltage will you go with shocking the other person. And what was found is people would do terrible things, even if they thought the other person was unconscious or possibly no longer even living. And so the conclusion is what was called the Lucifer effect, where you put people in the wrong situation and they can do the wrong thing. Now, as Christians, the language that we would use is a little bit different, but it's the idea that there is something depraved in each and every one of us, and none of us is totally good. And so if we tie it back to the idea of monsters, the real fear of a werewolf isn't so much that, like, out in the forest, there's something that's going to turn into a werewolf that's going to come get us. But the real fear is that within us, in the wrong circumstances, in the wrong time, in the wrong place, we become the wrong kind of person. And so that's what I'm referring to as this negative side of the monsters, is that we all have the propensity to do these terrible things.
And again, I think that's helpful because some people might, as we get into these three universal monsters, say, oh, yeah, I know people that have a problem with comparison, but I don't. I know some people that are really materialistic, but I'm not. I know some people that are just success driven, but I'm not. But if nothing else, what I think it does is sort of level the ground. And of course, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. And so let's get into these universal monsters, because the first one you really want to help us address is this whole idea of comparison. And I would have to say that if you are talking to teenagers, that's a really big issue. But even more so now with social media, wouldn't you agree that, as you just alluded to a few minutes ago, that when I see your Facebook post or whatever it might be, it could be Twitter posts, or it could be Snapchat, or it can be TikTok or whatever, I'm really seeing, if you will, the highlight reel, and I start comparing myself, even if I'm not necessarily that insecure. And that's why the reasons you wrote that chapter, isn't it?
I think you're spot on. I think social media has definitely perpetuated that. In the book Addicted, talking about the rise of technology, there's a line in which the author makes the argument that the reason that Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg acquired Instagram is because they know one thing in common, that both Facebook and Instagram realizes that people love to compare. And while in generations past, we would have to compare over long periods of time, and you would eventually share your pictures of your vacation with your friends, or eventually they'd come over and see what your house looked like. Now with social media, we are comparing in real time. And so every day we see, oh, you posted something about your kids or your grandkids, and how many likes and how many comments did you get based on that compared to someone else who posts the same thing. And so we're always comparing. And the monster of comparison is this, it's this real common situation that I think everyone has, whether you're a little kid and you're on the playground trying to see who's the fastest, or you get older and you try to figure out, oh, who gets to go on the nicest vacations, or who has the most picture perfect family who gets together for Thanksgiving. It's just in all of us.
And again, one of the things you talk about is how to kind of break that down. And maybe for just a minute, since you're a pastor, let's talk about this, because you have other fellow pastors listening to this broadcast. You have elders, deacons, Bible teachers, Bible fellowship teachers. You have a whole section when you talk about that, the prop, the pull, the point, and the light. It does seem to me that the way you teach this is the way that I no doubt probably had the way you preached it in your church, and the way if somebody wanted to use this as a way to maybe begin to focus on this as a Bible study, it would be really a good kind of breakdown. So talk about how each one of the chapters has kind of subpoints underneath them so that you can actually teach that more effectively.
Well, like you said, my bread is buttered by my day job as a pastor. And so, everything is kind of filtered through that for me. And so for, all your listeners, which I assume are all astute listeners who've heard the story of Jonah, that might be a great way to kind of introduce these ideas, and then we can flesh them out with the specific monsters.
Sure, because you have that. That's good. Yeah.
But the story of Jonah, which you have this prophet who gets swallowed by this large creature in the ocean, which the Bible may not say, but we all know is a whale. I always taught that in Sunday school, so it has to be true. And so Jonah gets swallowed by this whale. And it'd be easy to think that the monster in the story of Jonah is about that whale that swallows him. But your astute listeners already know this. They realize that the most monstrous thing that swallowed Jonah was not that whale, but it was the hatred that swallowed his heart. And the hatred for the Ninevites, this wicked town that did terrible things to his people, and he hated them. And so the pull of his hatred is that it made his heart so far away from the heart of God. God's heart was actually for Jonah's worst enemies. And the pull of the Ninevites is that his heart became so full of hatred that it was far from God. But the point of the monster in his life, it wasn't the whale, it was about the hatred. And the point is that he was given an invitation by God to let his heart become conformed to God's heart. Now, unfortunately, the story of Jonah doesn't end very well, because 3 times in chapter 4, he says, you know what? I would rather be dead than love these people. I'd rather be dead than to celebrate them receiving the boundless love of God. And so the light never really got in, but that was the opportunity for him. So in the same way, most of the time when we find ourselves comparing to someone else, the actual person that we're looking at and going, are they a little better than me or not? It's not about them. It never was about them. If you move to a different town, a different place, it's going to be a different person because the issue is not about that unique person. Okay? And so they're just the prop in the story. And the actual pull is that what happens when we find ourselves comparing ourselves to someone else is that we are pulled onto this sliding scale with our identity. And our identity is this restless reality because when you are comparing, you're always looking at someone who's better or worse than you. It's like the story of Saul. At the end of his life, there's this song that gets sung about him and the guy who's going to take over for him. And the song goes, Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands.
Yeah.
Now, like I'm not in the military. I've never killed anyone. But if I was, I would assume killing 1,000 people is a lot for a soldier to kill, right? Like that seems like it's a lot. Which compared to the guy who was the American sniper, Chris Kyle, I think his count was like 160 or 180. So I know as followers of Jesus, the numbers, that seems a little bit hard to compare and to think about in a positive sense maybe for some of us. But the idea is Saul had a great deal of success, but all of a sudden someone came along and was way better than him. So he became insecure because there was someone with just a little bit more than him. And that's what happens with comparison. We're either arrogant or depressed when it comes to comparison because our identity is based on something that's not stable.
Yes.
And so the pull of comparison is that we lose our identity. We live with this restless inner workings. But the point is with comparison,
the scale,
is that all along,
and need to take a break. But again, this stable scale, and then of course the light is your lane. But we need to finish that after the break. So, again, I just love this: the prop, the pull, the point, the light. We've talked about it with Jonah, and we'll come back and talk about this in terms of comparison. Get into some of those other universal monsters right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Luke Norsworthy as we talk about his book, Befriending Your Monsters, and focusing a lot of our time and attention right now on these three universal monsters. And there's a very good reason for that. You might remember the name Henry Nouwen, who oftentimes said there are three lies. You know, I am what other people say or think about me. I am what I have, and I am what I do. So that's one of the reasons we're talking about things like comparison, more, and success. And you were pointing out not only with the book of Jonah, but even in each one of your chapters, you take the prop, the pull, the point, and the light. And if nothing else, I love the way you break that down because it helps us understand, Luke, what really is important and really what's driving the story, or in this case, what's driving that particular monster in your life.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think that one of the biggest problems that many of us face is that we see what's right in front of us and we think that's the real issue. And we think the easiest thing for us to diagnose or detect is actually the source of the problem, when what most of us find is, as we try to work through who we are and what we've become, is that the real issue is underneath the surface.
Yes. So again, this one on the idea of comparison, certainly a big problem, but so that we can cover some of the others, let's move on, because one of the others is the issue of more, the idea that I need more, it's never enough. And in some respects, you again break that down to help us understand that sometimes we're not really understanding what it is that actually drives this consumer mentality, or even this kind of addictive mentality that some of us have adopted here in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think one of the things that the monster of more, and this idea that I constantly need more experience or pleasure or, fame or notoriety or whatever it is the idea that if I get enough of whatever substance that is, that I'll somehow be full. When the truth is, we are all these cracked vessels, that we are all groaning in this age, waiting for redemption. And so there's nothing that we can put in this vessel that's going to fill it up. And once you start to accept that, then you start to diagnose and see things not as something that will be inept at filling a need that you want full, but instead you receive them not with the sense of desire for them to be something they can, but instead you receive them as what they are, and that is a gift. So whatever is in front of you stops having to fill a hole that it can never fill, but instead becomes this gift.
So again, part of that is to, again, break it down to what you say. The prop is I need more. The pull, never enough. The point, never full. And then what's the light, this idea of gifted? How does that maybe help us understand some of the things that are affecting us?
Well, I love the way that Brene Brown says that it's a practice of joy, that joy doesn't just naturally happen. You have to work at it. And when you start to develop this practice of working at gratitude, you live into what, Paul commands us, that, I command you to give thanks in all circumstances. So this idea of giving thanks in all circumstances becomes, as Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians, that it is God's will for us. God's will for you is to give thanks in all circumstances. And so as we live into this disposition, something happens to us, one, because we're living into God's will for us, because God's will is for us, again, to give thanks in all circumstances. And once you do the work at that, it changes your perspective on everything else, because it's like one time my brother gave me a Snuggie for Christmas. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a Snuggie before, but I would never buy one. It's like this weird combination of a blanket and a sweatshirt, which I don't have the book of Leviticus memorized, but I assume somewhere in Leviticus it says it's a sin to have those, because you shouldn't mix a blanket and a sweatshirt together. Nevertheless, he gave me one. It was a funny gag gift. And so I come home, I throw it behind my reading chair in my office, and I don't think about it until like a week later. I'm cold, and I realize, I have this Snuggie behind me. And so I do the unthinkable thing. I take it out of the bag, and I actually put it on. And turns out it is quite functional. It's warm, and you can read at the same time. It's pretty amazing. But I never would have bought that gift for myself. I never would have. I never would have bought myself a Snuggie. But when it was gifted to me, I received it without asking questions. In the same way that every good and perfect gift comes down to us from the Father of lights, we start to receive everything, whether it is an extra moment we get in solitude because we're sitting in traffic, or whether it is a sprained ankle, which means we can't go outside, we have to stay home, or maybe more pressing right now is we are told that, we can't go certain places, we got to stay home, we got to quarantine. And for some of us, we're realizing that this might be a gift, because people like me, I've got 3 young daughters. I'm spending more time with them now than I ever have before. Like I was a somewhat involved present father, but this became a gift to me, because now when I'm working from home, breaks are not me goofing around with my coworkers, but it's getting to go on a little bike ride with my daughters. And I see this as a gift.
So well said. And I love what you say. If you were going to buy a house, you'd examine the home for flaws and faults and all sorts of things. But just imagine how different you would act if somebody just gave you that exact house as a gift. Well, whether you're talking about a Snuggie, and I'll never think of a Snuggie in a different way now that I've read your book, or a house, but apply that to spiritual gifts or gifts of time, talent, treasure, whatever it might be. I think it just, again, just illustrates that. But I want to keep it moving, because we want to get to the other one, and that is success. I am what I do. Now, in some respects, there's a good bit of overlap, as you pointed out, with more, but let's talk our way through again the prop, the pull, the point, and the light, because, again, this desire to have success certainly affects all of us, and even people in ministry. Matter of fact, sometimes pastors get together. How many did you have in congregation this week? How many did you have? So success is certainly an issue there as well. So what can you share about that with us?
Well, I think you're exactly right. Those of us in ministry, we often revert to maybe the lowest common denominator of our country, and our country loves to know someone's in the winner's circle. It's how we treat them. It's how we identify them. And early on in ministry, I realized that happens in ministry just as much with any other vocation. I was a young man. I took over this interdenominational Bible study that had about 1,000 college kids coming to it, and it was that way before I was a preacher. So not all about me by any means. But I took it over, and I was 21 years old at the time, and I was going on a trip with Compassion International, actually, and people asked, what I did. There's this couple, 4 people who were on the same flight, and they asked what I did. So, I'm in seminary, but I'm a preacher as well. And they go, where do you preach? And I told them, and they said their first question was, how many people attend?
There you go.
Because that's their way of stacking up. Like, are you in the winner's circle or not?
Mm-hmm.
And if like you said, Henry, now it's the temptation is I am what I do. If I am what I do, I better be doing it well, because that determines if I'm in the winner's circle or not, which all of a sudden pulls us into understanding that how I perform, whether how good of a parent I am, how good of a preacher I am, whatever it is, that defines me. So it's not like you lose at work or you got let go at work, but you failed. I'm a failure. I got fired. Those things are definition statements. But I think the point is that it never was about you. It never was about your performance. One of my favorite stories of the life of Jesus is he is baptized, comes up out of the water, and that voice from above says, "This is my son with whom I'm well pleased." And you think about that in the time of Jesus' ministry. What has he done? He got lost when he was like 12 at the temple. He hasn't preached any sermons. He hasn't walked on water. He hasn't raised anyone from the dead. He hasn't done anything. The Sermon on the Mount hasn't been preached. Yet God looks at him and says, "This is my son with whom I'm well pleased," before he did anything. And I think what happens when we no longer can hold on to the charade that we're always successful is that we've got to quiet our soul, and it's no longer the boos or the cheers that we hear, but instead it is the voice from above that says, "This is my daughter. This is my son with whom I'm well pleased." Because you can't always be in the winner's circle. And so you got to be somewhere else.
Wonderful. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation. We've talked about meeting monsters, and we've already focused now on 3 universal monsters: comparison and more and success. But after the break, I thought we might focus on some of the latter chapters there, the monster-friendly life. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know a little bit more about Luke, because it seems to me that not only has he written this book, but I understand that he has a podcast. So we're going to talk about that. And so you can learn a little bit more about him, find the podcast. There's also just a great little video that's on the website there as well. That's a nice kind of video book trailer. It's about 2.5 minutes long, so you might want to watch it. Then my suggestion is that you might want to click that share button, put it on your Facebook page or Twitter feed or something like that, and let other people know about this particular book. And again, as we mentioned just a minute ago, this is a great book for you to read through. through. But again, since he is a pastor and because he's put it in a format that I think works very well, this would be something you might want to teach in your small group. So when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about the monster-friendly life, but also what's available on his website and how maybe some of you in areas of spiritual and biblical leadership might be able to use this to train and to teach others and to really begin a conversation about some of these things, some of these monsters that affect our lives. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Luke Norsworthy about his book, Befriending Your Monsters, Facing the Darkness of Your Fears to Experience the Light. All that coming up right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes as we talk about the book Befriending Your Monsters. Again, it's published by Baker. You perhaps can find it in your local bookstore, but we've given you an opportunity to get it both in paperback and Kindle. And Luke, the last section there, the monster-friendly life, how not to dress your monster, how not to find your monster, or where not to find your monster, and what not to expect from your monster. Each one of those kind of gives you some helpful suggestions on dealing with some of these things that are very significant temptations or monsters in our lives. So what would you recommend to listeners that say, okay, you've identified some of the problems in my life. What can I do about it?
Well, I would say the first thing you want to do is not expect something from your monster that's unrealistic. One of the things that, I've gotten asked a lot is, how come the book is entitled Befriending Your Monster, not eradicating or defeating or vanquishing your monster? And the reason is because I can't write that book. I've never experienced that. I've never been able to get rid of everything I struggle with. And I don't think the Apostle Paul did either. I think the Apostle Paul prayed 3 times for a thorn to be removed from his flesh, and it didn't get removed. But instead, God told him, my grace is enough for you. And I would say one of the things that you see kind of across, different monster stories and different lores about monsters, which, again, we all know those are fake, is that monsters will get defeated, they'll go away, the town will have peace, and then all of a sudden the monster or the monster's mom or the monster's sibling will come back and haunt the village again. And so they have to repeat, they have to defeat the monster, and then it will come back again after a period of peace. So you have this kind of cycle that it's times of ease and then times of struggle. And when it comes to us, there is no silver bullet that's going to get rid of every monster that we struggle with. But what we do have is the ability to realize that day by day, when you take it one step at a time, one day at a time, when you pray for your daily bread, God will show up and something miraculous happens, that you keep doing the work and you keep being faithful to the Spirit's leading your life, and that God can change you.
And so, again, you talk about this idea of armor, approval, because if others like me, I may not be insignificant. Power, because if I get strong enough, nothing can hurt me. Pleasure, because if I can feel comfortable enough, I will not feel the pain. Control, because if I have control, I won't seem weak or small. First of all, as the old guy around the table, let's just admit that those things just never really happen. We're all looking for the silver bullet, as you mentioned. And back to the Apostle Paul, used a good illustration. He says, I find myself doing the very things that I hate. Okay, if one of the great leaders of the Christian world admits that it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 3 steps forward, 4 steps back, that gives me an understanding that this is part of sanctification, part of the growth as a Christian, and I'm never going to completely defeat my monster, but maybe I can learn how, as you said, to befriend my monster and understand that these are going to be temptations, but I certainly can depend upon God's Spirit working in my life to get a victory over those from time to time.
Yeah, I think that's it. You mentioned the psychiatrist who came up with the phrase inferiority complex. He talks about those 6 different things that we use to kind of mask these senses, the sense of inferiority. Those all, like you said, they turn out to be futile because we can't be good enough. We can't overcome. We can't be successful. We can't master enough things. But what we do have, and this is my perspective as a person of faith, is we have the Spirit's work in us. And I think what happens is that you do these small things every day. You submit to prayer. You submit to times of reading Scripture. You submit to confessing or helping the poor, or being in an intentional community with other people. What happens is I think God shows up in those moments in a way that you start to change, and all of a sudden, what had a death grip on you 10 years ago, it might still be there. But the way that you've been shaped and molded over that last decade is that you become a person who's aware that it is always present. The struggle is always there. But I've found ways to rely on God's Spirit so that I can have a life that is faithful to who God wants me to be, even if I'm always going to be tempted with these things.
Just before we run out of time, I wanted to get 2 things on the table. One, how maybe some of our listeners who are in positions of leadership can use the book. And then second of all, we have a link to your website because I want people to know about your podcast and some of the work that you're doing. But first of all, any individual, Luke, can read this and benefit tremendously. But the way you've put it together, I think could really be used in a small group or a Bible study. What have you found? Hey,
Tim, from your lips to God's ears, let's make that happen. I think you're right on. Let's do it. Obviously I wrote this, part of the way that I write, at least at this stage of my life, is I'm trying to make sense of my own struggles and my own issues, and the book was a great excuse to do that. So, it was very autobiographical and personal for me, but I do think it would be a great conversation starter. And, from what I've found, a lot of people have issues with comparison or success or wanting more than what they have. And so, I think in your groups or, as a sermon series, I think go for it. I love the idea.
And so that's one idea. The other is let's go to your website. It's LukeNorsworthy.com. Even you don't have to know how to spell it because we've got the link there. And you've got a podcast and all sorts of other things. So when you click on the podcast, you have all sorts of different individuals. The first one that pops up there is Jonathan Merritt, who's been in the studio with us before, The Monster of Success. You have one by Manda Carpenter on The Monster of Comparison. You have one by Annie Downs on The Monster of More. And the point I'm making is that then that podcast could be used by some of these teachers, and people could benefit tremendously from not only what you've written in the book, but even then they could play that or pull excerpts out and use that in a way for their teaching. So talk about what is available to our listeners.
Well, like you said, I'm fortunate enough that I get to do a podcast. And so I've had a couple of my friends come on the podcast and talk about the specific monsters. Jonathan Merritt, some of your listeners might know his father, James, who was former president of the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention. And so he came on as someone who wanted to talk about the Monster of Success. My friend Annie F. Downs, who maybe some of your listeners know from her podcast, the That Sounds Fun podcast, or 100 Days to Brave. She's someone who's able to give kind of her take on the Monster of More. So, yeah, we've got some examples of some of my friends talking about those monsters. And, what I think is really encouraging for a lot of people is to have other people really put the skin in the game of what those monsters look like for them. Because vulnerability in others is something we see as bravery, but vulnerability in ourselves seems like weakness. And sometimes we don't want to be that vulnerable and talk about our struggles, but to let someone else set the example for us can really give us some freedom. So hopefully those things do that for you.
Let me just mention we have a link to your Facebook posts and Twitter posts and those kinds of things. We, of course, have a link there not only to this book, Befriending Your Monsters, but the previous book, God Over Good. And so that is another resource that is available. So if nothing else, there's just a lot of opportunity here for people to come to grips with some of their fears, some of their temptation, and to get victory over them. And so if nothing else, I appreciate Luke not only writing the book, but thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View so that we could get into this in more detail.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much. I'm very honored. Thank you.
Let me just, before we wind down today, just mention that, as he points out, we all know that the monsters that we see in our film and even monsters we read about in our books, and he does talk about some like Frankenstein and werewolves and things like that, but we know that they are fake. But the reality is that even though those are fake monsters, there are monsters in our lives, and I think he does such a great job of really breaking it down into the three areas. The monster of comparison. I am what others say about me. The monster of more. I am what I have. And the monster of success. I am what I do. So if you find yourself saying, golly, this is a pretty good book. It is published by Baker. You might be able to find it in your local bookstore, but we have a way for you to get it both in paperback and Kindle. And it may be something you might want to use to teach others in your community, because I think you're going to find that very helpful. And if you'd like to know more about his podcast, that is available there as well. And of course, we have all sorts of great information, as we always do, on our website, which is pointofview.net. Find lots of great information. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, we have a lot more to cover right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today talking about Islam. It's been a while since we've done so. I might just mention that we do have a little booklet that we do make available free of charge on just kind of a general overview on Islam. And we're going to talk about a book that I think you might want to get a copy of, which, of course, that will cost you, but it is certainly well worth your financial investment. It's part of the 40 Questions series. If you're not familiar with that, there are various questions about 40 questions about angels, demons, and spiritual warfare. 40 questions about creation, evolution, 40 questions about heaven and hell, 40 questions about salvation, 40 questions about end times, and this one is 40 questions about Islam. And since we have so many of our Muslim friends, neighbors, and co-workers, it's always helpful to understand them. So there are 40 different questions in 7 parts that I think you're going to find very helpful, and it is a very well-written book in kind of a question-answer format. It is written by Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. He holds a Ph.D. in missiology from Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he is an assistant professor of missions and theology at Cedarville University and joins us now by phone. So, Dr. Bennett, thank you so very much for addressing this issue, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Absolutely, Kerby. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's get right into this, because what we need to do is understand a lot of different aspects. And the first of those is some of the history of Islam, which, of course, is tied to a man by the name of Muhammad, who was indeed in Mecca, later went to Medina, and established what today is the second largest religion in the world, one of the fastest growing religions in the world. But what do we need to know about the history of Islam, and in particular the person of Muhammad?
Yeah, and I think the history of Islam and its development is an incredibly important question in and of itself, but even maybe before that, we need to recognize that there's differing opinions as to what constitutes an actual historical account of its development.
Very true.
So
Yeah.
even as you mentioned Muhammad's birth and Muhammad being in Mecca and transitioning to Medina and starting this new religion, that is one account of the Islamic history and probably the prevailing one within the traditional Islamic worldview. But increasingly, there are scholars who are saying there's reason to raise some questions about how much of that detail is to be considered historically admissible data. So I'd caveat this first question simply by saying that some of our attention to the study of Islam needs to recognize that we're dealing with a traditional understanding of Islam as we articulate the received account, but it may not necessarily be as objectively objectively straightforward as it's going to be portrayed.
And let's talk about that for just a second, because there's the first difference between, say, Christianity and Islam, because we assume, although the liberal scholars for a long time challenged, but now I think most everybody assumes that you have the various records of Jesus written during the life and times of those people who were his followers. We have multiple copies and manuscripts. You have really almost just the opposite with Islam. You have a tradition that goes on for a long period of time. You have different Qurans, if you will, and eventually you have one that's, if you will, the established one. So in some respects, you've got something very different with Islam than you do, say, with Christianity. True?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's interesting is that for such a huge movement, such as Islam, that today can be seen as the world's second largest faith, its historical origins are rather shrouded in terms of any extra Islamic attestation to whether or not these events happened as they are portrayed. In fact, some of the earliest documentation of things that Muhammad said or where he lived or where he ministered come to us by documents that aren't any closer to Muhammad's life than a couple hundred years. And
yes.
So there's some interesting questions to be asked in terms of an academic study, but I do think before I undermine the account that is held traditionally among Muslims, there's a whole lot of importance for those of us who want to have meaningful conversations with our Muslim friends to be familiar with those traditional accounts, even if there are some potentially dubious claims that are made
Sure.
about that.
Well, let's talk about the traditional history, and then maybe after the break we'll get into the sources of authority, because we all, I think, can say that if you accept the tradition that is used most often, he came from humble origins, lived in Mecca. His father died before he was born. His mother died. He was raised by a grandfather who died, an uncle, traveled in caravans. But give us a little bit of a history, just real briefly, of Muhammad, because that is, in a sense, he is obviously the central figure of Islam, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. And his story is formative for the understanding of why his ministry was so important in his day and age. So as you mentioned, he came from humble origins, had a rather tragic beginning, and was born in the area of Mecca, which was known as a center of polytheistic worship. One of the things that traditional accounts recognize about Muhammad is even through his boyhood, he was recognized as somebody who was pious and yet not convinced that the polytheism around him, the pagan worship around him, was appropriate. And so he was constantly retreating to the desert to meditate and to consider the world around him and to seek what is truth and who this true God is standing behind all things. And over time, he became convinced that monotheism was the right way forward in contrast to the community around him. And so his initial ministry in Mecca is a ministry against paganism, against idolatry, and pushing towards the worship of the one true God. There's a number of formative elements throughout his youth that contribute to this, but probably the most poignant place where he found his commission was one day when he had retreated to a specific cave called the Cave of Hira in the desert. He encountered what he initially thought was a demon oppressing him, that pressed on his chest and demanded that he recite on 3 occasions. And at that point, traditional Islamic history believes that he was receiving the first commission as a messenger of Islam. Some traditions believe that in that cave he actually became privy to the whole of the Quran that would later be dispensed to him occasionally throughout his ministry. But really it was at that point that after he returned home and recounted these events to his wife, she clarified that it wasn't a demon who was oppressing him, but rather was the angel Gabriel, or Gabriel.
Gabriel, yes. Let me take a break because I want to come back and talk about that, because that, of course, brings us to where he is in Mecca. Then he goes to an oasis later called Medina. And, of course, you talk about the Quran, and that gets us into the source, at least one of the sources of authority for Islam, along with the Sunnah. And, of course, then we learn a little bit about the theology. And just a fascinating book, and it is part of that 40 Questions series. This one's 40 Questions about Islam. And we have information about this book and about our author on our website, pointofview.net. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Michael Berry opens his commentary with these words: 246 years after the U.S. Army was established, today's Department of Defense appears to be distracted from its national defense mission. He should know. He has served as a Marine in the military and heads up the military division of First Liberty Institute. He is also the only conservative participant in the Pentagon's newly formed Countering Extremism Working Group. He explains that the Pentagon is on a mission to identify and remove whoever it labels as extremists from America's armed forces. Unfortunately, he notes that the working group has yet to define what it means by extremism. His experience in defending chaplains and other members of the military lead him to conclude that this working group may target constitutionally protected speech. In other words, sticks and stones may break our bones, but words are the biggest threat. Usually, when we are talking about religious liberty cases within the military, we're talking about threats from outside groups that object to chaplains being too religious. Imagine that. But now there appears to be threats to First Amendment rights from within the military itself. He acknowledges that eradicating the scourge of actual extremism is a noble undertaking, but this latest program within the administration will certainly divide us. The message being sent seems to suggest that conservatives and religious people are unwelcome in the military. Yet these values that these groups hold to are what encouraged Michael Berry to join the Marine Corps. Those would be love of country, pride in service, and respect for selfless service and sacrifice. I appreciate him for alerting us to these concerns, and I applaud him for serving on the working group. I just wish there were more like him serving in that capacity. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett, and he is the author of this book, 40 Questions About Islam. It is part of the 40 Questions series. And Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, go back to this a revelation supposedly from Gabriel, recite, which of course brings us to the Quran. But then as he begins, that is, Muhammad begins to preach this strict kind of monotheism in a pluralistic culture, in a polytheistic culture, there was a lot of persecution, which is eventually why he left Mecca. True?
Exactly. Yeah. So all of this actually focuses attention on what Muhammad believed himself to be doing as he took up this mantle of a prophet. And I think it's pertinent for us as Christians to consider why this part of the story ends up being somewhat confusing to our Muslim friends when we begin pointing out differences between Christianity and Islam. Because as Muhammad is living in this polytheistic environment and receiving a commission from the angel Gabriel to preach monotheism, he begins to see himself as continuing in the line of prophets who came before him, continuing in the same line as Moses, continuing in the same line as Jesus. And so, yes, he faces persecution in Mecca eventually and relocates to Medina, but when he finds himself in Medina, he begins to appeal to the Jewish communities there, and he sees himself as somebody who should be received by this community because he's one like them. And so at that point, when the Jewish community begins to respond by rejecting his mantle of prophecy, this is really one of the major fissures between Islam and the revelation that came before. It's really at that point that Islam starts to take on its own unique identity by turning away from the Jews and subsequently turning away from the Christians and recognizing Muhammad as that final seal of the prophets who has put a cap on revelation. So it's in Medina that Muhammad's followers really sort of take on their own identity and become an entity unto themselves.
Which kind of brings us then to the Quran, because if you read the Quran, and Dr. Bennett, I usually say to my Christian audience, I don't encourage it for your daily quiet time, but for those of us that have taken the time to read it, you see some very contradictory kinds of things, because the surahs, the chapters that he wrote when he was in Mecca, the Meccan surahs, are really very different than the ones that he wrote later in Medina, the Medinan surahs, because now he's no longer just a prophet like he was in Mecca. He's also kind of a warrior. And so we see in the Quran a variety of other, if you will, statements being made that are very different. And so in some respects, help us understand the importance of the Quran. As valuable as Christians value our Bibles, the Quran, I see in Muslim homes, is even more valuable. It's sometimes placed in the highest spot in the area. It is treated with tremendous reverence. Not that we don't treat our Bibles, but we tend to mark our Bibles up and turn them around and flip them and all sorts of things. So explain the importance of the Quran in Islam, because that is a significant part of the Muslim teaching, isn't it?
It is, yes. One of the chapters that I have in my book, though, kind of taps on this particular question and says, the Quran is certainly something that is viewed as the source of God's revelation once and for all to humanity. It is a clear Arabic message, is what it reports for itself, of God's direction and guidance for his people. But in function, the Quran actually is so located linguistically and culturally in a 7th century Arabian context that there is little practical influence in the daily life of a Muslim that it exhibits. So it can be something that sits up high on a shelf. It can be elevated and even memorized. But when a Muslim approaches the Quran, their intent is to exhibit their own pious reverence for the book and perhaps to memorize sections of it, even memorizing the entirety of the Quran, which is one of the badges of honor within Islam. But when we as Christians, particularly evangelicals, go to Scripture, we're trying to see its message and to understand it and to ask, Lord, what would you say to me in these living words? And how does this impact my understanding of who you are and how I should live in light of that? And that second process is actually foreign to the practice of Islam, because most Muslims find themselves picking up the Quran, reading an old Arabic language that they don't use anymore, that has its own poetic nuances to it, and saying, I don't actually know what to do with this. And so it's in that point that we get to the second layer of authority, which is called the Sunnah within Islam, that gives traditional explanations of when Muhammad received this particular verse in Mecca or in Medina, these are the actions that he took, or these are the statements he made. And those things end up being more interpretive and explanatory value of the Quran than the Quran itself can be for the average Muslim. And so what we see is that these late traditions formed 200, 300 years after Muhammad's death end up having much more influence on the daily practice of a Muslim's faith.
And again, I've had some people that said, I've read the Quran, I don't get it. I mean, it's got some stories, it looks like the Old Testament, a few things like that. And I said, well, that's because what guides the day-to-day life of most Muslims that you know is not the Quran, but it's the Hadith, it's the Sunnah, it is those things. Or even in countries that are dominated by Muslim thought, it's the Sharia law, which I guess we should get into as well, because those traditions actually govern your day-to-day actions, govern how certain cases are going to be adjudicated within a court. And so in some respects, understanding those may be even more important than understanding the Quran.
Certainly, if you're looking to understand your Muslim neighbor or to ask the question, well, why do they pray in that fashion and that number of times per day? Actually, if you were to look at the 5 pillars of Islamic practice, each one of them would have maybe its roots in the Quran, but the actual specifics are detailed in the Hadith or the Sunnah literature. So, for example, if you were to look through the Quran and see where are the 5 daily prayers that are mandated within Islam, you could get 3, maybe 4 listed in different places that you could compile. But it's not until you appeal to the Hadith to hear a story about Muhammad going before God himself and having to barter with him down from 50 prayers a day down to 5 that you get that number. And so even the core elements of Islamic practice, these 5 pillars, require this later material to give shape and detail to the practice of Islam.
And again, you mentioned the 5 pillars of Islam, but since I'm coming to a break, I want to give you a break to kind of focus on that, but we'll come back and talk about this idea of the 5 pillars of Islam and then even some of the 6 articles of faith, and then we'll talk about some of the differences between Shiite and Sunni. But let me just real quickly, as we're going to a break, mention that this is a book that you should be able to easily find in your bookstore, but if you cannot, we have a link so that you can get it in paperback. It's published by our friends at Kriegel, and there are 40 different questions with answers in 7 sections. We won't cover all of it, no way we could possibly do so, but let me alert a few of you, and that is the fact that each one of these questions has a very good detail with a number of footnotes, and then at the end of each one of the chapters, there are usually about 5 reflection questions. So if you've been thinking, we'd really like to be able to educate our listeners about Islam. We have Muslim friends, neighbors, co-workers, maybe even sometimes family members, and we really want some people that are in our church, in our small groups, to understand a little bit more about reaching out to the Muslims around them. This would be a perfect series. You could do, of course, 1 chapter a week, and that would take you most of the year. Or you could do 1 section a week, and that would be 7. That would certainly be enough as well. So again, 40 different questions, 7 different parts and categories with reflection questions at the end. It's just perfect for not only individual study, but for those of you that are small group teachers or Bible fellowship leaders, let me just encourage you to get a copy of the book. And if you find yourself saying, I went to find it in my local bookstore, but I couldn't find it, we have a link to it right here on our website. And so you can get it both in paperback and Kindle. 40 Questions About Islam. The guest that we have today, Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. And when we come back, we'll look at a little bit more on those 5 pillars of Islam and some of the differences between various Muslims around the world. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again as we talk about this book, 40 Questions About Islam by Dr. Matthew Aaron Bennett. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a copy of the book, no doubt you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. It came out this year, but nevertheless, if you have any difficulty at all, we have an opportunity for you to order it either in paperback or Kindle. And Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, continue on. The theology of Islam, the 5 pillars of Islam. So let's first of all talk about the things that almost all Muslims would agree in, and then we'll talk about some of the major divisions in Islam. But what about the 5 pillars of Islam that you alluded to in the last segment?
Yeah, so if you open up any sort of an introductory book about Islam, this is going to be something that features in its introduction section, trying to identify what are the commonalities between Muslims across the globe. And probably some of the easiest things to see are these 5 pillars. They're 5 actions that make a person a good Muslim. The first one is making the Islamic confession, which is called the Shahada, which is basically the confession there is no God but the God, or Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger, or the prophet of God. So that confession is something that Muslims hear every day. When I lived in North Africa and the Middle East, we heard it 5 times a day as part of the call to prayer. It's a confession that binds the community in unity, and it's also the way that if you were to be an adult convert to Islam, you would join the community, would be by making this confession that there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet. That confession leads to a number of different actions in light of believing that there is one God who has a way of living. The first is the 5 daily prayers that I mentioned. One thing that's important for Christians to note when we say prayers, there are 2 different words for prayer within Islam. There is dua, which is what we typically think of when we think of an extemporaneous prayer, where we're petitioning God with our needs or worshiping him over out of the abundance of our joy. But this particular prayer is much more of a ritualized and memorized, embodied practice, where you go into the mosque ideally and pray shoulder to shoulder facing Mecca with the community of Muslims, following some ritualized motions and reciting a memorized prayer. So in many ways, this is an interruption to a person's day, 5 times each day, 7 days a week, in which they are forced to remember that there is a God who stands above them and who orders their life. So those 5 daily prayers are the second pillar. Once a year, they interrupt their lives for a period of 30 days where they fast. And this is called Saum, or Ramadan fasting. We actually just completed the month of Ramadan in the last several weeks here. And during this time, Muslims refrain from eating or drinking or having sex within marriage during the daytime hours for these 30 days. This is a time for the community to, again, interrupt the normal life of the calendar year in order to remind themselves that they are ultimately under God's authority. The fourth of the pillars is almsgiving or charity. It's called zakat. They're supposed to give 2.5% of their income to charity, either through the mosque or directly to the poor. And then the final thing is that once in their lifetime, they are to attempt a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is known as the Hajj. And this pilgrimage takes them back to the place where Muhammad was traditionally thought to have been born, and also the place that after his people established themselves as an independent and strong community of faith, it's the place that they marched victoriously on, and Muhammad overtook Mecca. At the center of this particular pilgrimage is the fancy word for it is circumambulation, but the idea that they are to walk around this central temple known as the Kaaba, which during Muhammad's day served as the center of polytheism, but which, after he liberated the city from its polytheism, was dedicated to the one true God. So these are the 5 pillars that make up common Islamic practice and form the basis of what's expected of a good Muslim.
And again, you go into some of the other theological ideas in the articles of faith, but I thought for just a minute, since we're talking about the similarities, anybody that has been watching the news over these last few decades knows that there are very different views about the Quran, about how this should be worshipped. And the differences are between the Sunnis, which are primarily the majority, and those are the kind of Muslims you'd find, for example, in Turkey or Egypt or other places, and the Shia, those found primarily in the southern part of Iraq and in Iran. But that is very different. And again, back to the history, that goes back fairly early in terms of the split, in terms of who can be a caliph, who can be an imam, who can be the leader of Islam. So explain that, because that division is something we talk about so often here on Point of View.
Yeah, that division is something that has probably in recent days become more pronounced, as there are not only religious expressions involved, but also various political interests within those nations that you just listed that seem to be set up antithetically to one another, such that I think those distinctions have become convenient at times for politicians in that region to set themselves against the other nations represented by the opposing branch. Interestingly, my wife and I have befriended an Iraqi couple in Ohio here, and one of our first conversations, knowing that Iraq is a place of the presence of both Shia and Sunni, we asked them, which branch of Islam they come from, and they kind of chuckled, and they said, really, since the 1990s is the first that we have really thought about that in Iraq. They said, we got married, and on our wedding night, I found out that she was Sunni and I'm Shia. It didn't make any difference to us up till that point. So there's been some perhaps overstating of those differences as it has been politically convenient in recent times. But the traditional understanding of where those differences comes from is exactly what you alluded to, the proper understanding of who was supposed to lead the community of Muslims after Muhammad died. There's a traditional account that sees the first split between Shia and Sunni over this issue of the immediate successor upon Muhammad's death. The Shia believe that it should be somebody from within Muhammad's family, and his cousin Ali should have been the de facto leader, whereas the majority vote within the community went to Abu Bakr, who was one of Muhammad's nearest associates. Over time, what you see is that Ali ends up being the fourth ruler over the entire community anyway, but the Shia have already established that they don't follow the leadership of the intervening caliphs. And so at that point of following the right succession of leadership is really one of the places that you begin to see this divide. They believe in the same Quran. They practice largely the same pillars, adhere to the same articles of faith, with some slight differences. And then their secondary body of literature, the Shia have some teachings that have authoritative binding on their community in a way that would not be recognized among the Sunni. So those are the major differences.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into maybe just a little bit about how we can maybe share the gospel with our Muslim friends. But again, we've only skipped around a little bit. We've talked briefly about some of the traditional history of Islam, the sources of authority for Islam, even some of the theology of Islam. Haven't really gotten into much on the practice of Islam, but some fascinating chapters there, and the whole issue of the Quran and the Bible, and even some of the scholarship. But I thought this last section here on the Christian gospel and followers of Islam, how can we use some of the things that Muslims say? How can we share love and even the gospel with Muslims, how we can even develop a love for our Muslim friends. And so we're going to spend some time in the last segment talking about this. But if you find yourself saying, this really would be something I'd like to study, or perhaps for those of you that are small group leaders or Bible fellowship leaders, this would be something we could teach in our Sunday school class. This is just a great resource. 40 different questions in 7 different categories. As I said before, you could do one a week and take you almost a year, or you could take each one of the sections and have people read multiple chapters each week, and that would still take you 7 weeks. And there's some great questions already built in. Be very easy to teach. Let's take a break. We'll talk more about some of these 40 questions about Islam right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
40 questions about Islam. Dr. Matthew Bennett with us. And just for a few more minutes, Dr. Bennett, let's, if we can, talk about witnessing to our Muslim friends. And there are a couple of things that I'm sure you would want to mention. One is sometimes we as Christians have some misconceptions about Muslims. But my experience has been that Muslims have a lot of misconceptions about what Christianity is or is not, about some of the basic doctrines of Christianity. So as we share the gospel, sometimes we have to be willing to explain or maybe clarify some of the misconceptions that they might have. But as an individual that has lived in Africa and has been involved in this in the Middle East, has been teaching on this for years, can you give us some ideas about how we could approach our Muslim neighbors and things to say, maybe things not to say, some kind of do's and don'ts? What could you share with us?
Yeah, I think this is honestly the reason that I wrote this whole book. So you mentioned it's 7 parts long. The first 6 parts really build a foundation to get to this 7th part, because I found that, honestly, our Muslim friends and neighbors are, yes, maybe misinformed or have misconceptions about Christianity, but they're also curious, and they want to engage in conversation. And I think so often, particularly for those of us living in the United States, our understanding of Islam comes from whichever news source we tend to go to for news. So on one hand, we may see Muslims as those who are antithetically opposed to everything we stand for and are, just going to become terrorists at any moment. And on the other hand, we may see Muslims as just worshiping the same sort of God as we do, and so we should all just get along. But I want us to pave that middle road of saying our Muslim friends and neighbors are bearing the image of God as human beings, and as long as they are sucking breath, they have the opportunity to be prompted by the Spirit to respond to the gospel message. And so they need that message. So what is our responsibility as Christians? It is to be there to explain and to help them understand the message of Scripture. And I think one of the things that we find is that our posture, once it changes to being open to sharing with our Muslim friends and engaging that curiosity, is the first thing that needs to shift. But then when we begin explaining the gospel, there's many times that we can leave frustrated. And I found this in my own experience, saying, I know that I just spoke the gospel, but I could tell that it didn't actually get communicated. Where is that missing link between what is being said and what is being received? And I think that's the reason that I find it so important that we educate ourselves about Islam, because for us to explain the Christian gospel requires us to use words that for our Muslim friends already come preloaded with Islamic meaning, not biblical meaning. And so when we say things like, Christ died according to the Scriptures for our sins, we begin to use categories like Christ, which shows up in the Quran, but in a different fashion. We talk about sins, which shows up in the Quran, but in a different fashion. And we talk about Christ's atoning death, which the Quran categorically rejects. And so even in that simple statement, what is communicated is being received in the categories and by the definitions that come preloaded with Islamic baggage. So our task of actually explaining the gospel to our Muslim friends should begin much further back. I joke with some of my students saying, how many of you have ever explained the gospel using the book of Leviticus? And I have actually had one student raise his hand and say, yes, I have. But most of them kind of laugh it off until I say, is it possible to explain Christ's death and resurrection, his ascension and session as our great high priest without referring to Leviticus? And then I use that to show that our Muslim friends don't have the categories of sacrifice and atonement that come from Leviticus so as to make sense of a God-man who would die in our place, who would shed his blood and present it before the right hand of God. And so our task in sharing the gospel with our Muslim friends should begin by asking them questions and not assuming that just because we share language like sin and Christ and atonement, that communicates the same thing. Rather, we need to ask questions and listen to their response, and then invite them to read Scripture for themselves, because that's really going to be the place where the Spirit softens their heart and shows them that there's distinct categories and distinct ways that these important words function within the Bible that are at odds with the way that those concepts land in the Quran.
And I loved your point about asking questions. First of all, didn't Jesus ask a lot of questions in the New Testament? But even more so, if you ask questions, it's been my experience, which is certainly more limited than yours, but nevertheless, sometimes you talk to Muslims and you realize, I may know as much about the Quran as they do. I may know as much about what Muslims typically believe than they do, because it may get into a situation where they maybe are kind of secularized in terms of the Muslim faith. I grew up in a Muslim country. I've come to this country, and I really don't even know that much about it. It's just part of my heritage, but I really don't study it. I don't go to the mosque. I don't even necessarily know. Or they may have some misconceptions about Jesus and what it means for him to be a Messiah, like you said, sin, or a variety of other things. So that is certainly the case. But since we're just about out of time, one of the things that I've said, and I want to hear your comments, is that I think this would be certainly a great book for individual study. But I know, Dr. Bennett, that we have a lot of listeners who are pastors, Sunday school teachers, small group leaders, and others. And the way you've put together these 40 questions in 7 categories with discussion questions at the end, I think this could really be taught in a small group Bible study or something of that nature. What do you think could actually be used?
Absolutely, and that's been my heartbeat. I mean, on one hand, I've recognized this is an academic book in some ways within Kriegel's line, and so it does have that potential to be used in a classroom. But my purpose in writing it was to put it in the hands of people who are leading others, whether those are pastors or small group leaders, who are seeing Muslims in their neighborhood and not knowing how to respond, but wanting to do so. And so I absolutely would commend it for that sort of a group study or individual study, for the purpose of beginning to help yourself not know everything there is about Islam, but rather be able to ask informed questions of the Muslim people who are inhabiting the place the Lord has placed you.
And I might just mention that Bruce Riley Ashford, who's been on the program with us many times, said 40 Questions About Islam is the best one-stop introduction to Islam written by an evangelical Christian. In it, Matthew Bennett provides concise and reliable answers to the most important questions people have about Islam and Muslims, encouraging Christians all the while to relate lovingly, respectfully, and evangelically to their Muslim neighbors. Recommended highly without reservation. So, if nothing else, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to focus some time and attention on this book. And Dr. Matthew Bennett, I appreciate you writing the book, and I appreciate you giving us an entire hour today here on Point of View.
Kerby, it's my pleasure. Thank you for it.
Well, let's, if we can, take a break. Let me just mention again, one of the things we have made available in the past is this little booklet on Islam that I've put together, and it recommends some other books, and maybe when we revise it, I might even add this book to the list of books that we would recommend, because we are convinced that you need to know more about Islam, and certainly know more about your Muslim friends, neighbors, and coworkers. So again, that's one of the reasons we have focused our time and attention on this particular book. If you go to the website right now, which is pointofview.net, click on the picture of the book. It gives you an opportunity to order it if you would like to do so, either in paperback or Kindle. You might want to get multiple copies for a small group study, and so we have it available to you right there on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.